Germany during the Second World War. So on September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, which started World War II. By the end of 1941, Germany controlled most of Europe and a large area of the USSR. This made treatment of the Jews much worse and just developed their persecution. So now the Nazis no longer worried for acceptable policies to world opinion, and this meant that more Jews were in the control of the Nazis. There was 3 million Jews in Poland and 1 million in southern US in the southern Soviet Union. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, they built ghettos. So from last time, we know that they crushed 380,000 Jews in Warsaw alone. By 1942, 50,000 Jews had already died of hunger, cold, and disease in those ghettos. And we also know that the Nazis built concentration camps as early as 1933, such as Dachau. But they also created death camps where Jews would be rounded up and gassed to die. There was also SS death squads. This was called the Einsatzgruppen. In 1939 and 1941, the SS death squad would follow the German army into Poland and the Soviet Union, systematically murdering any Jews that they saw. By 1945, the Einsatzgruppen had already killed 1.5 million Jews, Gypsies, and communist leaders. There's also the Jew problem, where in January 1942, leading Nazis met at the 1C house in Berlin to work out the details of the final solution. The final solution basically meant that all Jews would be exterminated. They wouldn't be safe for work, but most of them would be dead. Work started on the camp, and in March 1942, the first death camp started operating in Belzec, Poland. There were 6 death camps at first, and none of them were in Germany, because, of course, Hitler did not want the normal German people to find out what atrocities they were committing against the Jews. So, the majority of Jews were killed as soon as possible. They would be sent into the death camps by train and gassed. However, the very fit people would be worked to death on building projects and autobahns. For normal German people during 1939 to 1942, morale stayed the same. They were winning, and most of the people were on rations because Hitler knew from World War I that rationing had undermined the Kaiser, so he wanted to keep spirits high and confidence in the Nazi Party high. But this changed in 1942 when the Nazis could not advance further into the Soviet Union in 1942, and by 1943 the Germans were in retreat from Africa and Italy. In May 1942, food shortages reduced the weekly bread and meat rations and reduced the standard of living. So another source of suffering for normal German people was the constant bombing that started to happen. In May 1942, it saw the first 1,000 bomber attack on Cologne. And in 1943, 50,000 German civilians died in the space of a week on Hamburg. On 2nd of February 1943, the 94,000 German soldiers that had been fighting for Stalingrad had surrendered to the Soviet army. It was a terrible defeat, and on 18th February, Goebbels had made his longest ever radio speech on every German radio station. He basically called out for everyone that had any exception to the enlistment and entrapment to the war effort to be exempt. So he called for longer working hours and all women aged 17 to 45 to register for work. This conflicted with their past ideology of the Nazis, where Nazis made women stop working to become mothers and good wives. But now, since 1942, he realized that the war production had to continue, but without the men, because they were fighting for Germany, the Nazis needed women to work for Germany. Closure of bars, nightclubs, and luxury shops, such as clothing shops, and many restaurants were closed so that people could stop going to these luxurious activities. Rationing increased because there was less food available at that time and travel was restricted. And so as the war went on, rationing, standard of living fell, which further developed opposition to Hitler. In 1933, with the Enabling Act, we know that Hitler had already banned all political parties, but opposition to Hitler grew as the Nazis' policies against Jews, freedom of speech, and privacy had begun to develop. So people started to rebel against the Nazis, and there were a lot of opposition groups on the rise. So this included the White Rose Group, so included some students, and it was started in 1941. So they handed out leaflets calling for democracy and social justice, and they painted messages on walls against the Nazis. This was because the leader of the White Rose Group saw firsthand the effects of the Nazis as he saw Jews being murdered in Poland. Another form of resistance was the Edelweiss Pirates. These were youth groups that beat up members of the Hitler Youth and in general were rebelling the Nazi way of life. They listened to swing music. They basically just opposed everything the Nazis stood for. Swing music, just subhuman music in general. They mixed girls with boys. The boys grew their hair long, and they had graffitis of anti-Nazi slogans. There was also religious opposition, as a Protestant by the name of Bonhoeffer was a pastor who joined German military intelligence and tried to use his position there to undermine the Nazis. He helped Jews escape to Switzerland, and he passed messages to allies to help them. Unfortunately, he was caught in 1943, and he was imprisoned and then hanged in 1945. There was also military opposition to Hitler because Hitler was only a corporal. The officer class in German society had never been natural supporters of the Nazis. So there were several plots on his life after 1942, and the most famous is 1944, which is the July bomb plot. So Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg was one of the many senior officers at the War Office in Berlin who, by 1944, believed that Hitler was leading Germany to inevitable defeat. So on 20th July, he brought a suitcase, which is a bomb, into a meeting with Hitler. So he put it on Hitler's table, and then he went out for a call. 12 minutes later, the bomb was detonated. Unfortunately, the suitcase was moved by another person, and so Hitler escaped by a fraction of a second, and he only had singed clothes, temporary deafness, and a cut hand. Over 5,000 people were arrested for their seemingly association with this plot, and everyone was executed, such as the colonel. So between 1939 and 1941, we know that the Second World War went well for Hitler. However, in 1941 to 1942, it was a turning point. By this time, in December 1941, the United States joined the war effort for the Allies. During 1942, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union stalled, and the Allies won important victories in North Africa. Germany lost the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, and the Allies invaded Italy from North Africa. Then they invaded France in June 1944. The Germans were in retreat on the southern and western fronts. So there are many reasons as to why the Nazis were defeated in World War II. There were two key reasons for this. Germany failed to defeat Britain in air and sea war, and Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. The harsh weather conditions meant that the Nazis were simply not used to the weather conditions, the harsh weather conditions that presented them. Another reason why Germany lost was because December 1941, USA had entered. At this point, it was a war of attrition. Germany was worn down by a stronger enemy because it was the USA, Soviet Union, and France, and Britain. And by 1944, we know that Germany had been increasing their war production, but at this point they were losing. Compared to the German side, the Allies were producing twice as much steel, four times as many planes and tanks, and 7 times as many rifles and machine guns. The Allies had air superiority of 70 planes to 1 plane on D-Day on June 1944. So the USSR invasion was a huge mistake by Hitler because it was a huge country to conquer, so it would have taken too much time and too much land to conquer. And the USSR had a population of almost 200 million, which it could have to fight and help with the war effort. And of course, the bad weather conditions made fighting very difficult. And this was a very, very bad decision from Hitler to override his generals' key decisions. He did not want to withdraw from Stalingrad early enough, and he did not see the war in North Africa important enough until it was too late and the Allies started advancing. He also backed the wrong scientific projects. The Allies invested in atomic bombs, as we know in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while Hitler invested in V1 and V2 rockets, which made little to no effect on the war itself. And Hitler's Nazi philosophies also slowed down and damaged the war effort. He allowed the SS and the German army too much control of the economy, and we know that with the traditionalist views of the Nazis, he was too slow to use women in the labor force, as women were just simply useless. They were just wives and mothers, and the war effort was simply not good enough for Germany. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Hitler married his mistress at that time, Eva Braun, and both of them went into a bunker. They swallowed cyanide capsules each, and Hitler shot himself in the head.